A Flash Outside the Off Stump, Episode 4, Walkabout. When the Aborigines arrived in Melbourne for their Boxing Day fixture in 1866, the idea that they would ever one day tour England would have seemed preposterous, and the result of the match probably did little to change this. 8,000 spectators excitedly crowded into the ground for the spectacle, and one can only imagine how the Aborigines, who were used to the sparsely populated bushlands of Western Victoria, felt at being hemmed in by such a large and noisy crowd. Their play was described as nervous and flat-footed, with 7 of the team out for a duck in a first innings which yielded a mere 39 runs. Melbourne responded with a first innings total of 101, and while the Aborigines' second innings was an improvement, reaching 87, Melbourne won comfortably. Although they lost the game, they had won the hearts of spectators and the press. Furthermore, although many of the team had proved ineffectual, 3 were singled out for particular praise. Johnny Cousins for his bowling, and Johnny Muller and Bullocky for their batting. While the Aborigines had acquitted themselves well in Melbourne and were well received, there was also a slightly patronising air about the press coverage.
The match proved that the blackfella has an extraordinary readiness for picking up a knowledge of cricket, however deficient he may be in other respects. It is only reasonable to suppose that if properly managed and instructed, the native race might have been turned to much better account, and that instead of gradually dying off the face of the earth, they might have become civilised and respectable members of society.
And the Sydney Mail's correspondent reported that
a dark skin suddenly became the passport to the good graces of Victorians.
One of the spectators at the Boxing Day match was Captain W.E.B. Gurnett, who claimed to be a man of substance from Sydney. Whether he was a deliberate confidence trickster or merely an over-ambitious entrepreneur who gambled more on his enterprises than he could really afford has long been debated. But whichever is the case, he certainly wasn't a real captain, naval or military. Whereas the primary motive of the Edenhope backers of the tour to Melbourne seems to have been to showcase Aboriginal talent and improve the image of Indigenous Australians, Gurnett saw that their novelty value had enormous financial potential too. Consequently, he proposed a 12-month tour to New South Wales and England, all expenses paid and with the promise of generous bonuses on their return. Wills and the Aborigines quickly signed up to play, and Heyman was recruited as their manager, with a mission to organise more warm-up matches and recruit more reserve players from Western Victoria. While back home recruiting these additional players, Heyman also toured the stations where his original team members worked, seeking permission for them to be absent for the year. Permission was granted, but on the condition that they were accompanied by Heyman at all times. Much can be read into this. On the one hand, there is evidence that the settlers around Edenhope regarded their Aboriginal employees as potentially vulnerable away from their natural environment, and wanted Heyman to keep a friendly and protective eye on them as a matter of paternal concern. Certainly there's no evidence that Heyman ever had anything other than the welfare of his team at heart. However, some commentators have seen the conditions attached to the Aborigines' trip in a more sinister light, seeing it as an attempt to shackle the Aborigines to their home stations as if they were property or slaves. It is likely that the Aborigines really did see themselves as belonging to the sheep stations too, although not necessarily in quite the same way as their white employers. Such was the size of most sheep stations that they encompassed considerable swathes of tribal territory. Most of the Aboriginals in the team worked near where they were born, and their attachment to their ancestral lands was strong. At the time of the cricket tour, white labour was often in short supply on the stations, as it was attracted to other parts of Australia by the lure of the goldfields. And it was thus mutually beneficial for settlers and Aborigines alike if the latter could stay and work on the stations. After the tour, however, the state government introduced laws prohibiting Aborigines from leaving Victoria. Ostensibly, this was for the Aborigines' own protection, but it effectively placed massive restrictions on where they could live and work, and certainly killed off the prospects of any further overseas tours for the Aboriginals, and arguably was one reason why none of them was able to claim a regular place in the state team, as they would be prohibited in taking part in away games. Although widely recognised as one of the finest all-rounders of his generation, Johnny Muller was only able to play for Victoria once after the new law, a home game against Lord Harris's England team in 1879. Concerned that they might be left destitute in England, the Central Board for the Protection of Aboriginals had considered stopping the team leaving Victoria in 1867, but had discovered that they were powerless to do so. They did, however, insist that Gurnet lodge a bond with them for the Aborigines' fare home in the event of the tour's financial failure, and the sum of £1,000 was mentioned. Gurnet possibly promised them some kind of guarantee, but then seems to have promptly left the state before paying. By the time the team reached Sydney, Gurnet's financial affairs were apparently unravelling, and in an attempt to dig himself out of trouble, he served the writ against Wills and Heyman for breach of contract, with the result that they were actually arrested during their first match there. Gurnet had provided the team with no money, and Heyman had exhausted his limited resources paying for their travel and supporting them while he waited for Gurnet's proposed investment. Just as the Central Board had feared, they were stranded, and Gurnet used his contracts with them to prevent them leaving. Forced to arrange matches in the vicinity of Sydney to earn enough to live on, the team enlisted the help of Charles Lawrence, a former Surrey player and member of the All England 11 who had stayed on after their Australian tour in 1861-2, and who now ran a hotel in Manly. Well connected in New South Wales cricket circles, Lawrence was able to arrange a series of fixtures with local sides, while joining the Aboriginal side as an opening batsman. Eventually, Heyman and Lawrence managed to scrape together enough money to get the team back to Melbourne. The tour to Sydney had been disastrous. Heyman had lost £400, and none of the Aboriginal members of the team were paid. Worse still, 4 members of the team died of illness on the trip, ostensibly of pneumonia, but in circumstances where alcohol abuse was suspected to be a major contributory factor. It appeared that almost everything the Central Board for the Protection of Aborigines had feared had come to pass. As the rest of the team departed for Edenhope, Tom Wills remained in Melbourne to take up a coaching post there. But Charles Lawrence was already planning to resurrect the idea of a tour to England. Back in Edenhope, the Aborigines kept up a schedule of matches through the winter of 1867, and soon Lawrence had secured new backers for the England tour and arrived to contribute to the coaching of the team. Lawrence was also giving some thought to how a distinct team spirit and identity could be created for his side. Until the comparatively recent changes in one-day and particularly 2020 cricket, supporters of the game were used to the idea that cricket was played in white trousers, white shirts and white jumpers, a dress code which has been rigorously enforced across all levels of cricket for well over 100 years. But this has not always been the case. In the early days of cricket, players had worn their ordinary clothes, and this was still the case for many in the 1860s, although some professionals were apt to be snappy dressers at the wicket with loud shirts and waistcoats. In the previous century, when many aristocrats had built sides ostensibly composed of their friends and servants, it was not unusual for some of these teams to take to the field in brightly coloured liveries. When the Aborigines had played in Melbourne the previous year, they had done so in a white uniform with a red trim and belts and blue neckties. Lawrence decided that something bolder was required to catch the imagination of English audiences, and kitted his team out in white trousers and bright red shirts of the type made fashionable by the Italian military hero Garibaldi. To top this off, each player wore a blue sash and a different coloured cap, the colours of the caps to be printed against each player's name on the match programmes as an easy aid to identification. When it became apparent that it was sometimes difficult to see the colour of the caps easily from a distance, the sashes were changed to match the caps in colour. Lawrence had got the idea of the coloured caps from being a member of the All England 11, who had used the same system. Clever as the idea of colour-coding the players was, there was still room for confusion. Evidently there was not quite enough single colour caps to go around, so Sundown is listed as playing in check, H. Rose in Victoria tartan, and Tuppenny in McGregor tartan. To further add to the confusion, Brimbunya, who was commonly known by the English name Red Cap, wore a black cap to play cricket, while the red cap was worn by Johnny Muller. The Aborigines finally set sail from Sydney on the 8th of February 1868 on board the Parramatta, a clipper bound for England with a cargo of wool. For most of the team, sailing was initially a nerve-wracking experience, especially as Hayman, who they regarded as their most trusted friend, was not with them, having gone on ahead to organise fixtures and accommodation. However, Lawrence enlisted the help of the ship's master, Captain Williams, to calm their fears, and by the time they arrived in England, the Aborigines evidently regarded him as something of a father figure. They'd also proved very popular with the children and ladies on the voyage. By a remarkable coincidence, the Parramatta arrived in Gravesend on the 13th of May 1868, exactly 81 years to the day after the first fleet had sailed from the same port to set up the original colony. News of the Aborigines' arrival had already been filling newspaper columns in publications such as The Sportsman.
We understand that these sable cricketers, who have for some time been expected, were telegraphed off Penzance yesterday afternoon, so that in all probability they will appear in metropolitan cricketing circles during the present week.
While the Daily Telegraph added,
"Nothing of interest comes from Australia except gold nuggets and black cricketers."
Once safely landed in Kent, the team took up residence at Westmoreland, where they spent a few days acclimatising and training, amid great interest from the locals.
We had the pleasure of witnessing a few of the black Australian cricketers practice on Monday last, but we must confess that we were somewhat disappointed, probably owing to the reports that have been issued concerning them. They appeared on the ground, dressed uniformly in the ordinary Englishman's attire, with turbans surmounted with scarlet cloth. Muller and Cousins are doubtless their best players. Their batting is decidedly better than their fielding, the latter being indifferent. It, however, would be uncharitable to judge them on the high English standard of our great national game. No doubt they are more proficient in their own Aboriginal sports, which they will display at various exhibitions. In their bearing they are very polite and affable and appear to be a very jovial lot of men. They are the first Australian natives who have visited this country on such a novel expedition. But it must not be inferred that they are savages. On the contrary, the managers of the speculation make no pretence to anything other than purity of race and origin. They are perfectly civilised, having been brought in the bush to agricultural pursuits as assistants to Europeans, and the only language of which they have a perfect knowledge is English.
The team's first competitive fixture was against Surrey at the Oval a week later. A crowd of 7,000 turned out to watch the first day's play. Surrey batted first and made 222. The Aborigines were bowled out for 83 and forced to follow on, but their second innings was an improvement, and they scored a more creditable 132, with Muller, who had been top scorer in their first innings, notching up 73 runs in the second. Altogether, in 2 days of cricket and a day of athletics, 20,000 spectators attended, resulting in gate receipts of £603 2 shillings and sixpence, of which the touring side were able to keep £309 9 shillings and a penny after expenses. Financially, the tour had got off to a very satisfactory start, and despite the heavy defeat, the team had been well received by both press and public, with Muller's performance in particular resulting in his being chaired off the ground and awarded an additional cash prize as man of the match. Reporting on this opening match, the Sheffield Daily Telegraph was full of praise. This most interesting match, decidedly the event of the century, commenced today at the Oval, and the weather having cleared up, there was every prospect of a large gathering to witness the Blacks perform. Contrary to general expectation, the Aboriginal team turned out to be really a fine body of men, of superior type for Australians, and in build and physique not only far removed from the low Negro type of the genus Homo, but able to take their own part with well-developed Europeans. We cannot particularise in the limited time and space at our disposal, but we take the liberty of assuring those who have been led to believe that the Australians are a set of humbugs that they are very widely mistaken. These men show very superior cricket indeed. And the sorry comment was equally effusive, if perhaps a little patronising.
Of late, journalists have been called upon to chronicle a gratifying event. If the early settlers in the Australian bush had been told that the descendants of the naked savages who plundered their farms and set fire to their homesteads would be found, in this present year of grace, playing a friendly game of cricket with 11 white gentlemen upon the oval, they would have treated the prediction as an absurdity. But time works wonders, and one of these wonders is found in the rapid strides which have been made of late years by the Aborigines of the Southern Hemisphere. It is one of the cheering signs of the genuineness of that attachment evinced by the colonies for the mother country that English sports and pastimes are received with the greatest favour, and none more so than the time-honoured game of cricket, which has become very popular among the colonists. The native population have also caught the contagion, and the men, whose accomplishments were formerly confined to the dexterous use of the spear and boomerang, have now a desire to measure their skills as a cricketing 11. No doubt the colonists are not a little proud of their protégés, and have sent them across the sea to astonish the natives in this country, but rather fancy, although some of the clubs have been warned to look to their laurels, that the astonishment will be more at the players than at the play. Of course, it is not to be expected that men reclaimed from a race but recently plunged into the deepest barbarism can be placed on a footing with those who have enjoyed the advantages of civilized life, and that they are able to compete at all with their white brethren is a fact which redounds to their credit.
The vast majority of press coverage of the tour was in a similar vein, and would remain so throughout, although, as the tour wore on and became less of a novelty, coverage tended to become local rather than national. On the whole, the press were very supportive, and although they occasionally made remarks which would be considered extremely patronising today, very few negative comments were printed. One notable exception was the Times, which covered the Aborigines' opening match at the Oval and their first appearance at Lord's, after which they declared that Aboriginal standards of play were a travesty upon cricket and refused to give the tour any more coverage. All things considered, though, the tour had started very successfully, and both team and management had every reason to believe that it would continue along similar lines.